as we think about the church at the end of the first century. So this isn't a century into the church, but at the end of the first century, basically a century after the birth of Jesus, there is zero archaeological evidence that the church built anything, that it constructed anything, that it had any buildings. There are no burial markers in the archaeology for Christians from the first century. There were not enough Christians to leave a trail of cemetery kinds of evidence who died in the first century. And there are, of course, almost no references in the history. Josephus writes a significant history which is focused on Judea. As a Jew writing about Judea and trying to explain the wars and the revolt and all that to Romans, he mentions Christians twice. And the second time, it is widely believed that was added later by somebody. So it might be that Josephus mentions Christians only once. Philo, writing from Alexandria as a Hellenized Jew and writing all about the Old Testament, he pioneered allegorical interpretations of Scripture, says nothing about Christians. And so Christians still read Philo today, but it's to understand how Philo saw the Old Testament and the foundations of his thinking about scriptural interpretation. Tacitus is a Roman historian who writes extensively about the first century and says, and has one reference to Christians, probably. He's the guy that says the Jews were expelled from Rome under Claudius because of rioting about somebody named Chrestus. And so Tacitus, that's all he knows about Christians at the time. So the church is very small. The church doesn't leave any real footprint from the first century other than the scripture that we have. So it's reasonable to estimate that there may be 7, 8, maybe 10,000 people across the whole Roman Empire who are Christians, perhaps significantly less than that at the end of the first century, and then some thousands of others in the East, and that Christians at the end of the first century are primarily people in maybe 3 dozen cities, maybe 4 dozen. Mostly across the Roman Empire, but also out to the east. So what do? We do know some things about the church at the end of the first century. First of all, it was an island of mercy and security. Pagans at the time, pagan groups, pagan leaders, pagan priests, believed that mercy was a character defect, that providing for those in need was weakness. Okay, that's the culture at the time, where somebody who is weak should be left for dead. The church was countercultural in that it cared for widows and orphans. It cared for people in need. It fed people who had no resources to feed themselves. There was no place else to go to get that. So in the first century is a dangerous and difficult place. The Roman peace reduced some of the violence, but there was still huge levels of crime in the city, a lot of disease, and people who were by themselves were preyed upon. If you traveled alone, when you laid down to sleep, you were taking a significant risk that you would never wake up again, because if somebody found you in the dark, the chances that they'd stab you and take all your stuff was high. And so, people traveled in groups. People needed to be in groups. If you didn't have a significant family, you needed some other group connection. And the church was a group. It was a place to be protected. So, mercy is a key element of early church growth. And the early church is characterized by a family atmosphere, caring for one another, meeting in people's homes, connecting along family lines. The church is, at the end of the first century, seen by the Romans as a sect of Judaism. This helps avert persecution because Jews were exempted from all kinds of Roman laws and rules. It's a special category. And so Jews were exempted from this, and the church grew under this umbrella of Jewish exemption. This is part of the reason why there was so much conflict with Jewish groups early on, in the first century, etc., is the Jews felt that Christians were kind of taking advantage of things that were reserved for Jews. But the church grew a lot because of Jews. For Jews, the church was familiar. We retained the Old Testament. We believed in a God who steps into our lives. Jesus is the culmination of what you see with God walking with Adam and making promises to Abraham and giving power and words to Moses and speaking through his prophets and acting in all these ways down through the ages. Jesus comes as a culmination. So for pagans, the idea that God would step into the world was a crazy idea, but for Jews, it seemed consistent with all the things that they already believed. And so many Jews came into the church because the fulfillment of prophecy, the building on Jewish foundation, the monotheistic terms and ideas. Judaism was the only monotheistic idea in any kind of broad circulation before the time of Christ. So the early church was really attractive, in particular, to God-fearers. God-fearers were people that showed up at the synagogue and worshiped as the Jews did, but who did not convert to the full Jewish lifestyle. They didn't get circumcised. They didn't adopt Jewish dietary rules, but they sought God. And almost every synagogue of any size in a mixed community had God-fearers. And many, many of the God-fearers became Christians because there was no barrier for them about getting circumcised. Getting baptized was something that was much easier for them to do and to be willing to do. Really important to realize that the first century church is a respectful harbor for women and for slaves, for people that are disrespected and treated as property by the state and the culture. And that is true of both women and slaves in the first century across the Roman Empire and well beyond. And so we are heirs to an egalitarian faith where we all stand before God together. Jews and Greeks, men and women, slaves and free. And so that was different. And the early church was attractive to educated people because we had a real scripture. Pagans didn't have any scriptures. They didn't have anything to read. There was nothing to read, to ponder, to learn, to engage with. But Christianity had that. There was depth and substance as a result. Christianity is a faith that is built on understanding a whole corpus of written teaching, teaching of substance. And so that attracted people who were educated. And the idea that people that were God-fearers could avoid the circumcision and the dietary laws that Jews imposed on them if they converted to Judaism by becoming Christians was an attractive thing for those who were pursuing God in the first century. So you see the freedom from the details of the law in the life under a law of grace becomes an attractive reason to become part of the church. It is likely that in AD 100, the church was majority female, as it is today. So a few things as we think about the church in its beginning, at the end of the first century. But it's important to be thinking about, as we think about the first century, that by the second century, Mary Magdalene was being referred to as the apostle to the apostles because she was the one who was at the tomb. And she was the one at the tomb who was told, go tell Peter and the others. She was entrusted with the message that he is risen. The most important message in the history of the church, right? Was entrusted to a woman. Okay? And this is a powerful statement, okay? In the midst of a culture where women were not regarded as being able to testify in court. They were not regarded as reliable testimony, reliable witnesses by the judicial system. And that's true both for the Hebrew, the Jewish system, you're called before the Sanhedrin, and for the Roman system. I mean, this is a wider cultural thing, that women are disregarded, and yet it is Mary Magdalene who is given this message. He is risen, and told to go tell the apostles. Mary, the mother of John Mark, her house becomes the headquarters for the post-resurrection church. When they were all fearful that they were about to be arrested and executed, and they trusted her to provide a safe place to meet together as a large group that they could pray. Lydia of Philippi is the first convert at Philippi, potentially the leader, probably the leader of the Riverside Prayer Group that Paul goes and speaks to. She hosted Paul and hosted the church at Philippi in the early days in her home. As we discussed before, Priscilla, there's some minor reason to believe that she might even be the author of the book of Hebrews. Probably not, but it could be true. But she was clearly an honored and respected leader. And it is interesting that she is often listed in the Bible before her husband. Clearly they are full partners in ministry, and there were some ways in which she was the primary figure in that couple in terms of the work of the ministry. And that Paul may have depended on her to a greater degree than Aquila. For one reason or another. We see in the book of Romans, Junia and her apparent husband are listed as maybe, this is a debatable translation, but the idea of them being outstanding among the apostles. Probably it means they were honored by the apostles, but she's listed as a full partner with her husband. And when you read Romans chapter 16, it's important to realize that more than a third of those names are women. That Paul is taking time to honor, to greet, to remember, to ask for prayer for, not because they're ill, but because they are carrying the load of the ministry. Phoebe, the deaconess, or maybe just the great servant of the church at Cenchreae outside of Corinth, clearly an honored servant of the church. Paul finds it important, worthy to mention her in a letter to the church at Rome. So a few takeaways about women in the early church. There's a lot of different women in a lot of different roles here, moms and wives, but business women, independent women, women who had some role in service and were respected within the church. There is a great deal of respect and honor in a way that is totally countercultural to any of the three big cultural streams that we see merging in the early church. In the Jewish tradition, the New Testament honors women much more highly than the Jewish tradition did at the time. The New Testament honors women much more highly than the Roman tradition did at the time. The New Testament honors women much more highly than the Greek tradition, the Greek philosophical tradition of the time. Women are honored and respected in a way that is totally countercultural and are treated as if they are significant in service. They are very seldom formal leaders, but clearly they are often informal leaders of significance and substance and import in the life of the church. Now, today we get kind of feminist sorts of interpretations of a lot of first century stuff. feminist stuff that you may hear that is not true. There is a feminist interpretation that says that the first century church was matriarchal, that it was basically run by women, and that the men were basically guys that sat around and tried to figure out how to take credit for the good work that the women were doing. So not that that hasn't happened down through the ages, of course. But there's no evidence that fundamentally women were in charge of the church and the men basically were trying to find ways to pirate that. That's not really true. There is also a huge feminist thing over the last 40 or 50 years that women were really important in the first century church, and that Paul worked to suppress that. Paul worked to minimize that. Paul, who was such a fan of Priscilla, Paul, from whom we know about Junia, Paul, from whom we know about Phoebe, that Paul, okay, that doesn't work. Paul is the reason that we know about Lydia and Phoebe and Junia and Priscilla. It's through his ministry and his writings, the things that he did, that we are aware of these important women in the first century church. So coming up with the idea that somehow Paul has suppressed the truth here is that's not found in anything. And the Gnostics, of course, some of the Gnostics really played with the idea that, you know, once again, Mary Magdalene maybe had secret information, and, you know, she knew the stuff that the apostles just weren't up to speed enough to get a hold of, that kind of stuff. But nobody would have written that stuff if the church didn't treat these women as if they mattered. And that's countercultural in the day. And so we see from the very beginning that women matter in significant ways in the church. And so I think that's a really important takeaway as we think about the first century church.